But I think what may be, in fact, a much more concerning issue is what happens when you get lots of mutations in the germline cells, including human sperm. And we know that human sperm, you get these DNA effects from the kinds of exposures that many of us are exposed to every day. And so that's a major concern. And I have to say, I stated before with regard to the reproductive effects and the brain-related neurological, neuropsychiatric effects, that those I think are very far along in our societies and therefore are of great concern. I don't know how far along the mutational effects are. I have not been able to find any good data on what's happened to human mutation rates over the last 20 years or so, which is the kind of information that we really need. So I don't know whether they've gone way up or not. So it is a major concern of mine, this whole issue of germline mutations is a major concern of mine, but I just don't know how far along it is.
Okay. We've got, and on page 3 it says, other effects that show cumulative nature and apparent irreversibility are some, but not other, of the hormonal effects, Alzheimer's and other dementias, and the perinatal exposures involved in producing autism and neurological/neuropsychiatric effects, which have a high prevalence in our societies, and the reproductive effects, which also have a high prevalence. I've heard that the rate of autism has skyrocketed in the last 20 years, and there's obviously the vaccine concerns and so forth with people, but with the kind of inference in where it says perinatal exposures involved in producing autism and ADHD, are you seeing fairly substantial correlation with EMF exposure and autistic-like traits?
Okay, so let me say that there has not been nearly the amount of study that we need on this.
Sure.
So there's been very little in the way of, and I mentioned before that funding cutoffs in the U.S. have really completely hobbled anything going on here. So let me just say there have been a number of animal studies that have been done where late prenatal exposures in animals produce ADHD-like responses that which occur in the newborns and then stay there even without any other exposures through adulthood. So these are long-term changes in the neurological properties. There's some evidence for autism as well, but it's more limited. I think that the best evidence with regard to autism really has to do with what we know is involved in autism, and one of the things that's clearly involved is excessive calcium in the cells, which is the first thing that happens when you activate these voltage-gated calcium channels. You get excessive calcium in the cells. So there's a substantial literature on that, and there's also a substantial literature which shows that mutational changes that cause these voltage-gated calcium channels to be too active, to be much more active than normal, can cause autism. And we know that for certain, okay? So that's part of the story. I believe that, and let me just say, the autism and ADHD part of this, I think, can be argued. This is not established science. What we do have is, what I'm saying is that we don't have established science that says that these EMF exposures are the primary cause of autism. I believe that that's true, but we don't have definitive evidence on that, and I want to make that very clear.
Sure.
I also think that they're very plausible mechanisms in terms of how the excessive calcium in the cell can produce autism during the development of the developing brain. Okay. So during that process, in the late prenatal period and the early postnatal period, so just before birth and after birth, the brain in a baby, or in a baby animal for that matter, is forming very, very large numbers of synaptic connections. The individual neurons have to form synaptic connections with other neurons in order for the whole brain to function. Yeah. And that process has to be done properly, or you're going to inevitably end up with all kinds of problems with dysfunction. It turns out that the excessive calcium, which is the first thing that occurs in the cell when you activate these voltage-gated calcium channels, it has very important roles in regulating the formation of the synapses. So there are 5 known mechanisms that have important roles in regulating the synaptic formation during the development of the brain. And every single one of them are regulated by calcium in the cell. So I think these are very plausible mechanisms. But I have to say, as I said before, we don't know for certain that this is what's going on, but there is a strong argument that this is the way autism works. Let me just say one other thing, and that is there are also chemicals that can produce excessive calcium in the cell, and I think those also have important roles in causing autism. Autism is not a simple story.
No.
I don't want to imply to anyone that I think it is.
Oh no, but we can see. For instance, I've got another of one of your studies here, and it's not. It's not EMF related, but there's a correlation. Elevated nitric oxide, peroxynitrite theory of multiple chemical sensitivity, central role of NMDA receptors. I've seen a correlation with chronic fatigue syndrome. We're basically dealing with an invisible variable, which is becoming more prolific in our environment, that conceivably has a connection to a lot of these more recently abounding sort of maladies, and it would bode people to obviously be aware of their surroundings and try to remediate exposures to these things if possible, right?
Well, I agree, of course, yeah.
Sir, do you know of anything with regard to, now I know 5G, I think the FCC was set to auction off the 28 gigahertz band either later last year or sometime this year, but the millimeter waves that 5G is going to utilize, I've got a tri-field meter, and it only goes up to maybe, I think, 6 gigahertz. Would you know of any way that, the lay person would be able to, because I know 5G has a broad spectrum, it has a beamforming capacity and phased array, they can cover a wide spectrum, they can hone it in like a laser. Do you know if there's any way that people can meter or kind of determine any of these higher gigahertz frequencies and exposure to them and their surroundings?
Okay, so up until recently, there were no meters that were available that could, even at high cost, measure these millimeter wave frequencies. And then I believe early last year there were some that were coming out that were available, but they would cost like $60,000.
Yeah.
Now, my understanding is that they've dropped down to, I don't know, something like $15,000.
Okay.
And no doubt they'll drop more, but for an average person to buy one of these it's not something that you can do easily.
Yeah.
So whereas we have lots and lots of meters that measure within the microvoltage that are quite cheap. So there's a huge difference here. The thing I want to say about 5G is that the problem we have is not just that we have these millimeter wave frequencies that are being used, which I think are particularly problematic, and the fact that they're planning to put these all over the place in close juxtaposition to our houses. But that that we're talking about a system which is designed to be extremely highly pulsed, and as we talked about before, these pulsations means that these things are probably much more biologically active and therefore much more dangerous than anything we've had before because of the extraordinarily high level of pulsation the 5G is designed to entail. And so I am very concerned about 5G, and because I think it will be extraordinarily active. I'm also concerned for another reason, and that is that it's been argued, well, these millimeter waves don't really penetrate well into the body, and therefore it's only going to be surface effects within the outer millimeter or so of the body. The thing is that the electrical parts of these electromagnetic fields are not nearly as penetrating as the magnetic parts are. The magnetic parts just go straight through.
Okay.
When the magnetic parts of, let's say, 5G radiation go through your body, what do? They put forces on dissolved ions in the watery parts of our cells and bodies, the aqueous parts, and move them. And when they do that, they regenerate the electrical parts of the EMFs with the same frequencies and the same pulsations that the initial EMFs had, just much lower intensity.
Okay.
But one thing that we haven't talked about is that these voltage-gated calcium channels have a structure called the voltage sensor, which is predicted to be extraordinarily sensitive to the electrical forces of these EMFs. And so, levels that are many orders of magnitude lower than what we normally, get exposed to, can have effects deep in the body based on the mechanism we just discussed. And so, we're in, so, the plan that's approved by the FCC and the Congress is to put out literally tens of millions of these 5G antennae in close proximity to almost everything, such that you can't avoid them. And the plan is to do that without doing one single biological safety test on anything resembling genuine 5G, with all the pulsations it will entail. Yeah. That's just absolute insanity. I mean, it's crazy to do this.
Yeah, the only wording in the S1, I think it's S3157 was the federal fast track, and the state laws. The only thing they're referring to in those is putting a cap on the rent that Telecom's going to have to pay to mount these things on public utility poles. It's.
Well, this is. I think quite literally the craziest thing that anybody's ever thought to do in the history of the world, as far as I can figure. It's just insane.
I appreciate your professional opinion because I agree with you.
Yeah.
My goodness.
So that's where we are.